to the closing event of the 16th Marx Herbstschule with Gavin Mueller on the topic of Maschinenstürmerei. Gavin has published a book on this topic under the title Maschinenstürmer, Autonomie und Sabotage by Nautilus. This book, you can also buy it at the desk in front. The English title is slightly different, Breaking Things at Work. The Luddits were right about why you hate your job, published by Verso. As a good Hegelian, I believe that the truth is in the extremes and not in the middle between them. Regarding technique and machinery, we have one extreme in the bourgeois tradition as well as on the side of its great critique, Marxism. They both mostly share the view that the progress in science and technology will also bring a progress in society, and the Marxist tradition even saw here the potential growing for a preparation of another, different, a socialist society. The other extreme opposed to this tradition showed that the development of science and technology by no means corresponds to an improvement in society, and that it is not even designed to do so. In Marx, who, as is well known, is placed in the tradition of Hegel, we find both extremes, an optimistic and even emphatic view about technology, and a critical one showing its capitalist determination and use. Gavin Mueller has reconstructed the long tradition that stands for critique of technology, and indeed a rather practical critique. There is a long tradition we saw in the development of the capitalist means of production, especially in machinery and technology, means of domination and control, starting with the famous Luddits to the Wobblies to the current forms of Luddism in the high-tech sector. While Marx elaborated and pointed out especially the economic impact of technology and machinery, the effect for surplus production, for increasing productivity, etc., Gavin Mueller is showing the social and political implications as well as consequences of introducing new technologies and machineries, and he does this from the perspective of the workers who have to deal with it. And maybe Gavin is a good Hegelian too, if he wants to convince the Marxists of Luddism and the Luddites of Marxism. Apart from his current book, Gavin Mueller is the author of Media Piracy in the Culture Economy, Intellectual Property and Labor under Neoliberal Reconstructing, and he writes for the Jacobin magazine and Viewpoint, where he's also part of the editorial board, and he teaches media studies at the University of Amsterdam. Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. A little more of and thank you for coming. I was told that 11 a.m. on a Sunday is not the most advantageous time in Berlin. So I come from the Netherlands, where Calvinists are bright and early every day. So it's not such a problem for me. A bit more of my background. I have a PhD in cultural studies, and I read a lot of critical theory and also Marx and Marxism at that time. I started my degree in 2009, right after the financial crisis, which informed a lot of what I decided to study. In 2010, I was contacted by a BA student about a magazine he was starting on politics and culture, and if I would contribute. And this ended up being Jacobin magazine, which is still around today. And I contributed quite a lot in the first few years of its existence. In 2011, the Occupy movement reignited a kind of anti-capitalist left in the United States, though with a lot of chaos and confusion. And so I joined up with the Viewpoint magazine as an editor and contributor with the goal of providing sort of theoretical clarification for these struggles. And in doing so, I began to learn more about the history of workers' movements, genealogies of Marxist theory, and also participated in debates over questions of strategy, tactics, and analysis within this kind of anti-capitalist left that seemed, at least at the time, more political than academic, which is all to say that my book emerges as much from my engagement with movement as it does from academic study. And specifically, his project was provoked by discussions that were happening on the socialist left about technology. A lot of these derive from a kind of theoretical discussion of accelerationism, an idea which originates in the heterodox theories of Nick Land and was discussed in a manifesto by Nick Srinacek and Alex Williams. The idea that capitalism must be overcome not through resistance to its tendencies, but by pushing them further to accelerate their contradictions. So one tendency that jumped out at the time was capitalism's substitution of human labor for machines. This is in part provoked by an influential 2013 paper by two Oxford professors. One is an economist, the other is actually a computer scientist, called The Future of Employment, that predicted that 47% of jobs would be lost to automation by 2030. And this was published during the kind of shaky at best recovery from the global financial crisis and its ensuing recessions. And so it sparked kind of panic, right, that things would never go back the way they were. And so thought leaders from Stephen Hawking to Elon Musk had pronounced that AI and robotics would be this kind of existential threats to humanity. For those on the Marxist left who believe that workers are the vehicle of anti-capitalist politics, this is also something of a crisis. And of course, not exactly a new crisis. This is also a crisis the Marxist left faced in the 1970s, the generation before. But among some corners of the radical left, this news is greeted with a kind of optimism, even encouragement. Quote, "Our first demand is for a fully automated economy," declared the authors of the Accelerationist Manifesto, Nick Srinacek and Alex Williams, in their follow-up, Inventing the Future. Quote, "Using the latest technological developments, such an economy would aim to liberate humanity from the drudgery of work while simultaneously producing increasing amounts of wealth. So rather than mourn the loss of the worker, we should seize political opportunities from capitalism's technological abolition of work. After all, machines are simply tools without inherent politics of their own." Or as Peter Fraze puts it in his pro-automation polemic for Futures, who benefits from automation and who loses is ultimately a consequence not of the robots themselves, but of who owns them. And then Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism, which takes its name from an accelerationist meme, celebrates a variety of new technologies on the cusp, supposedly, of abolishing scarcity. So many of these works, and you will often hear the term post-work more than accelerationism, claim to be Marxist. And they often look toward Marx's fragment on machines, which, if you were at the talk last night, was very interesting. Ricardo Belfiore's kind of take on some of this. It's a passage from the Grundrisse that had already been made famous among writers, among the kind of technophilic wing of post-operismo, such as Antonio Negri and Carlo Barcelona. In the fragment, Marx speculates on the development of technology, and he seems to sketch a kind of future of fully automated production. Quote, "An automatic system of machinery, or perhaps even a fully automated system, driven by a general intellect," or in another translation into English, as Ricardo said, apparently I've been reading like the worst translations of Marx that are out there. It's my own fate, I suppose. The social brain is another way that gets translated. A system of accumulated technical knowledge that for some could be an anticipation of the digital networks of the internet. According to Marx, the development of productive forces reaches a level in which, quote, "It is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker, is itself the virtuoso. In this arrangement, the worker, quote, merely transmits the machine's work, the machine's action, onto the raw material, supervises it, and guards against interruptions." And Marx goes on to speculate that this will reach a point where the reduction of necessary labor time and the concomitant increase in surplus labor time, which is the time dedicated to capitalist profit rather than for necessary needs, becomes so dramatic that workers are able to kind of seize and transform surplus labor time into free time for their own social development. And this is another quote from the fragment: "Capital thus works towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production." When the fragment kind of was revived and popularized during the economic restructuring of the 1980s and 90s, with its deindustrialization and the rise of globally networked telecommunications, it seemed to some like it foretold the knowledge economy of digitally empowered immaterial laborers who coordinate, communicate, and create, tending to machines mentally rather than operating as a physical appendage of them. Machines take over physical production, while human beings focus on internet-enabled creativity and collaboration, educating themselves to acquire new skills and capacities, appropriating and developing the total social knowledge of humanity. This self-valorizing and self-organizing character of immaterial labor implies, for Hardin agreed, an egalitarian future. One of their lines from the early 2000s, "Immaterial labor thus seems to provide the potential for a kind of spontaneous and elementary communism." And then contemporary accelerationists like Aaron Mustani continue to refer to this passage as a kind of harbinger of a sort of future utopia. My intervention is to view technology in a different way, from the accelerationist or post-work viewpoint, where technology is either politically neutral or even, perhaps, unintentionally leads us into socialism. Instead, I take a critical viewpoint of technology, understanding it as a product of capitalist imperatives and therefore capitalist politics. I approach this from the perspective of the history of worker struggles. So rather than large-scale economic transformation, take the viewpoint of the workers, right? Workers in struggle often viewed new technology as antagonistic and resisted it in a variety of ways, including direct acts of destruction. And I begin my historical account with the Luddites, the 19th century weavers who smashed the mechanical devices that undermined their skilled livelihood. And admittedly, this is controversial. Most people think of the Luddites as opponents of technology, while Marx has been widely viewed as technologically optimistic, if not technologically determinist, in his own time, and in ours as well. And Marx even has a few condescending remarks for the Luddites in Capital, saying, quote, "It took both time and experience before the workers learned to distinguish between machinery and its employment by capital, and therefore to transfer their attacks from the material instruments of production to the form of society which utilizes those instruments." But, as my lovely introduction noted, there are other sides to Marx, and other ways to understand his project, and other ways to continue this project, besides letting the forces of history do their work. And so my method for reconciling Marx and the Luddites is twofold. First, I look at Marx's approach to politics, and one of the cornerstones of Marx's own view of radical practice, and what made him reluctant throughout his life to make programmatic arguments about a future egalitarian society, the cookshops of the future, was that communism was, quote, "not a state of affairs which is to be established." Oops. Yeah, there we go. Inspirational moment for Sunday morning. Not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. According to Marx, quote, "we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things." And so this perspective of Marx, not as a designer of future society, or even a theoretician of the necessary grounds for socialism, but as a cartographer of proletarian struggle that we should hold on to in our present moment. The struggles against machines were the struggles against a society that utilized them. And, moreover, these struggles had a number of important effects on the composition of the working class. In keeping an eye on a future technological society, we risk being blind to the one thing that mattered above all else to Marx: what kinds of struggles people were making against capitalism, how these struggles pulled people together into an antagonistic social formation, right, the composition of the class. My second method for reconciling Marx and the Luddites is that Marx's writing on technology is ambivalent. So in Capital, where he disses the Luddites, but he also says, quote, "It would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against working class revolt." And it is important to point out, as Michael Heinrich has, that the Grundrisse is incomplete and provisional, and Marx later altered and developed his analysis regarding technology. His most developed writing on this comes from an unpublished chapter in Capital called, at least in English, Results of the Immediate Production Process. It's included as an appendix in the Penguin edition. And Marx contrasts two ways that capital controls the production process with implications for the technology involved. So the first you have, formal subsumption. Independent craft laborers, such as the weavers who made up the Luddite Rebellion, work for capitalists who own the means of production, but control over the labor process is delegated to the workers, who carry on as they had when they themselves owned their tools. Quote, technologically speaking, the labor process goes on as before, with the proviso that it is now subordinated to capital. And then under the second form, real subsumption, capital restructures the labor process itself by introducing machines and other technologies. A complete revolution takes place in the mode of production itself, in the productivity of the workers, and in the relations between workers and capitalists. And I think that it's easy to ascribe a kind of temporality or directionality to formal and real subsumption, where the formal stage precedes a real one, and capitalist development tends inexorably towards real subsumption, and therefore de-skilling, automation, and therefore any kind of communism would have to be this sort of fully automated variety. I think this imposes a post-work futurism on Marx that his mature work does not totally support. In fact, it was his political and intellectual rival, Proudhon, who admonished workers to be more attentive to the teachings of destiny, and insisted that, quote, the guarantee of our liberty lies in the progress of our torture. I contend that subsumption is not inevitable or even irreversible. There's, Patrick Murray has some interesting writing on subsumption and temporality that also comes to kind of non-teleological conclusions. So instead, we should view subsumption as a site of struggle without preordained outcomes. So struggles over subsumption, whereby laborers fight against technologies that rationalize the production process according to capitalist values, characterize the original Luddites, as well as many other struggles, including contemporary struggles in digital culture today. I'm not the first Marxist to approach the Luddites sympathetically. Historian Eric Hobsbawm, in an early essay, offers a reevaluation of the Luddite movement, describing their actions as, quote, collective bargaining by riot. For Hobsbawm, machine breaking was one weapon among many against mill owners and the state, one entirely appropriate for the early 19th century. Quote, in those pre-socialist times, the working class was a crowd, not an army. Enlightened, orderly, bureaucratic strikes were impossible. Here, Hobsbawm's analysis reorients the discussion of the Luddites away from its quixotic outcome and towards an emphasis on class composition. And class composition was developed in the Italian context by theorists such as Ragno Panzieri and Sergio Bologna, Mario Tronti, to grasp the economic and political basis, new forms of resistance exhibited by youthful mass workers who have been de-skilled by the introduction of new machinery into factories. So class composition is an alternative notion of class as a pre-existing empirical category, such as what you might find in like a basic sociology textbook. So you have, this is like a basic sociology notion of class, where you look at someone's job or income, right, and determine their class. Right? Rather, class in the Marxist sense is organization forged through struggle itself. As Marx puts it in the 18th Brumaire, quote, insofar as millions of families live under conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interests, and their culture from those of other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection, and the identity of interest forms no community, no national bond, no political organization among them, they do not constitute a class. Right? So class is a political category rather than a sort of objective empirical category. In Hobsbawm's estimation, the working class activity of Luddites has to be understood in terms of existing technical composition, because workers have not yet been organized in a disciplined mass but were instead a melange of laborers working in their own homes and shops and often in their own tools, it was impossible for them to engage in the kind of militancy we associate with trade unions made up of mass workers. But Hobsbawm suggests something further, that through machine breaking itself, the Luddites composed themselves as a class by creating practices of solidarity. Marx detected subsumption, like so many other dynamics of capitalism, well before they reached their full flowering. The most significant advance in the science of real subsumption, that is, the capitalist reorganization of production, was Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Ricardo had some very interesting comments on Taylor as well, and I was actually in agreement with most of them. Taylor himself was not exactly scientific in his methods, something even his contemporaries criticized. Rather, he had a keen understanding of the politics at the point of production. When workers understood and had control over the productive process, often better than management, they could control its pace and work as they pleased, in the ways they pleased. For Taylor, this was slacking off, or what he called soldiering. He wanted workers to work at maximum capacity and full efficiency, or what he called the one best way. To achieve this, he had to, in the words of Harry Braverman, separate knowledge of production from its execution. So his method involved close observation and timing of the work process, which was then broken down into tightly controlled and standardized component tasks. Comprehensive knowledge of the production process was the sole preserve of management, who could redesign the shop floor for maximum physical control of workers' bodies. The assembly line, the Fortis assembly line, was a major development following this, really the realization of Taylorism. And incorporate worker technique into new technologies that could be operated by less skilled, more easily controlled workers. So real subsumption along Taylorist lines involves surveillance of the worker, reorganization of the technological environment for maximum control of the worker, acceleration of value extraction, de-skilling, and the obscuring of the totality of the productive process from the workers. It is eminently a political process with wide-ranging repercussions, and in Taylor's own time, it was perceived as such. His own interventions into the labor process met fierce resistance. Workers resented his omnipresent stopwatch and his imperious behavior. His first efforts at Bethlehem Steel, a rash of mechanical breakdowns, followed the imposition of his new times. Workers blamed the destruction on the elevated pace, but Taylor argued that, quote, these men were deliberately breaking their machines as part of the piecework war which was going on, and forced workers to pay for the repair of machines. At the Watertown Arsenal in 1911, he finally met his match. He fired a worker who refused to be timed by the stopwatch, and the rest of the plant went on strike. As this was a weapons manufactory, national security was at stake, and Taylor was called to account in sometimes grueling testimony before Congress. An exceedingly anxious person, he made a poor impression to the legislature, who decreed that the workers should be reinstated and Taylor's methods abandoned. And he actually kind of had a nervous breakdown, and his career was over, and he spent a few years redesigning golf clubs before he died. Such is his fate. So at this point in time, unions opposed scientific management. And an economist from the time, R.F. Hoxie, cataloged quote, more than 100 specific reasons given by union representatives for fighting against the hated Taylor system. Scientific management, properly applied, normally functioning, should it become universal, would spell the doom of effective unionism as it exists today. Amidst the debate over scientific management, the industrial workers of the world recognized its implications for class struggle as Taylorist rationalization spread through industry. The Wobblies, it's their nickname, as Mike Davis tells it, attempted to rank-and-file rebellion against the rationality of Taylor and the speed-up. Amid the heightened interest among workers, to militant opposition to new work methods, the IWW published two remarkable tracts in 1913 on the subject of sabotage. After one of these pamphlets was used to prosecute an organizer, the union withdrew them from publication and publicly renounced sabotage as a tactic. But I think there's actually quite interesting and worth looking at deeper. Sabotage at this time could mean any number of subversive techniques employed by a worker that interfered with production, from absenteeism, work slowdowns, working to rule, and even striking. It could refer to disrupting equipment, quote, the displacement of parts of machinery or the disarrangement of a whole machine, but it could also mean creating better quality products than the owners intended, quote, "The workers are coming to see that their class is the one whom adulterated food, shoddy clothing, and rotten materials are sold, and by refusing to adulterate products, they not only destroy the employer's profits, but safeguard their own lives as well," Walker C. Smith wrote. In fact, he argued with a note of irony that sabotage could even describe the actions of employers when they halted production by locking out workers. Smith argued that the benefits of sabotage were twofold. First, it had a direct economic impact on capitalists. Quote, "The aim is to hit the employer in his vital spot, his heart and soul, in other words, his pocketbook." Second, more important, is a means of developing militancy and solidarity among workers. Smith likened its effects on class struggle to those of guerrilla warfare. Quote, "Guerrilla warfare brings out the courage of individuals. It develops initiative, daring, resoluteness, and audacity. Sabotage does the same for its users. It is to the social war what guerrillas are to national wars. If it does no more than awaken a portion of the workers from their lethargy, it will have been justified. But it will do more than that. It will keep the workers awake and will incite them to do battle with masters. It will give added hope to the militant minority, the few who always bear the brunt of the struggle." The trade unions, which the IWW often held in contempt, would reconcile themselves to the Taylor system, as would the major parties representing Marxism. Both the SPD under Kautsky and the Bolsheviks under Lenin would support this capitalist science, adhering to a rather mechanical and determinist view of development, where, in Kautsky's words, quote, "The growing contradiction between the powers of production and the existing system of property would create an opening for a worker-led takeover of the system. For many socialists, the Taylor system was another example of how capitalism, in its pursuit of profit, raised productivity through competitive technological innovation and the discovery of efficient working methods. True, these new forms of work were difficult, dangerous, and widely hated, but if workers could table their protest about the productive forces, they could enjoy a world of plentiful goods and leisure eventually." In other words, socialist production was already contained within the capitalist mode of production, as long as the capitalist mode of production could continue to develop. This is, in my estimation, still the motivating kernel of much contemporary accelerationist theory, that technology unbounded will burst the shackles of our current world and lead us into a new one. In my opinion, this turned out to be a historical error, as fascism, itself an ideological formation, imbued with an infatuation with machines, marched victoriously through Europe. The writer Walter Benjamin sought to evaluate the historic failure of socialism on the continent. Writing in 1940, shortly before his death, he located the essential mistake in the belief of progress connected to the further development of productive technologies. He says, "There is nothing which has corrupted the German working class so much as the opinion that they were swimming with the tide. Technical developments counted to them as the course of the stream which they thought they were swimming in. From this, it was only a step to the illusion that the factory labor set forth by the path of technological progress represented a political achievement. Rather than a natural outgrowth of history's progression, for Benjamin, a revolutionary class had to, quote, explode the continuum of history. Indeed, this history is not a tale of progress or even a succession of events, but, quote, one single catastrophe which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet." Benjamin was more explicit on this point in the writings published as the Paralipomena on the concept of history. It's another inspirational meme for you this morning. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it's quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Here, an openly decelerationist Benjamin emerges. Technology does not lead towards a revolutionary break, nor does a revolutionary necessarily spur on new technological developments. Rather, Benjamin reconceives revolution as a cessation of catastrophe. It halts progress in its tracks. But what will motivate this revolutionary action, if not faith in technological progress the Second International wagered its fortunes upon? Benjamin looks to the past for inspiration, though not to see the wonders achieved by the bourgeoisie as Marx and Engels did in the heady days of 1848. Instead, Benjamin looks to class struggle. I'll save that one for the next. While that struggle may be one of loss and catastrophe, it is bequeathed to the present fine and spiritual qualities, he says. Quote, "They are present as confidence, as courage, as humor, as cunning, as steadfastness in this struggle, and they reach far back into the mists of time. they will, ever and anon, call every victory which has ever been won by the rulers into question. And I think these words echo the Wobbly Walker-Smith on the pedagogical function of sabotage. It contributes to the political composition of the class. Redemption from capitalism and its violence will not come from a simple appropriation of its devices. Instead, it is born on the backs of those sedimented experiences of the nameless people who fought against them, who broke, jammed, sabotaged, who grabbed for the emergency brake in their circumstances. And this is the raw material of future emancipation. So we may seem a universe away from the weavers of the early 19th century, the contortions of the socialist parties of the 20th, and even the refusals and rebellions of 50 years ago. But I would argue that the dominant paradigm for capitalist technological organization of labor still tends to be Taylorist, right? There have been experiments in Toyotism or lean production or other sort of post-Fordist initiatives, but these, I think, ultimately fail to break with Taylorism in significant ways or are short-lived dead ends, and everything kind of falls back to Taylorism. What this means is tightly controlled and standardized work processes, keeping workers in the dark about the totality of the labor process, accompanied by pervasive surveillance. So a perfect example of that, as you see up here, is the Amazon warehouses, which are kind of digitally enhanced Taylorism. And so Amazon even filed a patent for a cage for their pickers in the warehouse. And this was, when this was discovered, it was turned into a meme. So, the wage cage. So surveillance, data collection, the fragmentation of tasks into rote sets of automated instructions can describe the scientific management of the factory, as well as the new platforms of work and play emerging in digital space, where every movement is tracked, analyzed, and converted into value. Surveillance here is both disciplinary and productive in the Foucauldian sense. It creates more compliant worker subjectivities, but is also productive in a more mundane sense. The observation of the labor process can then be folded back into the design of technology and the workplace to further increase the leverage of management. A great example of this comes from a recent book by Phil Jones, Work Without the Worker, where he describes how click workers, who are responsible for data processing, basically the people who feed machine learning systems, AI. I always use scare quotes as my media studies professor hat on. Or actually responsible for what gets credited to machines, so they're actually doing the tasks, and then the company says, "Oh, this is our automated system." Right? They also produce data about their work processes, which can then be folded back into those same machine learning systems with the goal of eventually completely automating such work. One of the outcomes of the work is the worker's own obsolescence. Content moderation of social media is one place where this is explicitly the goal. This is, every social media company says they want to automate it, right? Although it's not very easy to do. Keyboard strokes, eye movements, accuracy, everything is tracked. In fact, this is not so different from how platforms track behavior of their users, redesigning interfaces and algorithms to better capture the time and extract the data of their users, right? Things like Instagram and TikTok. These micro workers are increasingly drawn from the populations of slums, prisons, and even refugee camps, and this is actually billed as a humanitarian endeavor to give employment to refugees, to pay them $1 a day. But even more privileged workers are subject to these dynamics. As the pandemic shuttered offices, the world of white-collar work was dramatically altered. Many commentators suggest permanently. Maybe some of you are still working from home since the lockdowns, right? Or at least have that option. Working from home poses a number of trade-offs, but many workers seem to enjoy a short commute and the feeling of autonomy that comes from the lack of the boss's physical presence. But of course, digital technology can provide. There are services like Hubstaff, Clever Control, and my personal favorite, Staff Cop, which monitor productivity, capturing screenshots and key logs of employees while limiting the types of software and websites that can be visited. Feed More does some great research on this kind of stuff. At-home digital Taylorism could be a post-pandemic future of work. and you'll pay for your own internet connection. Similar moves are happening in education. And here I recommend the work of Ben Williamson and Audrey Waters. So you have edtech services like Proctorio, punishing students for suspicious eye movements, with now predictable difficulties detecting non-white skin tones. And it is likely that if you followed some of the developments in this, in the UK there was a scandal over predictive grading by an algorithm. They had to cancel their national exams, and so they just used an algorithm to assign people a grade rather than actually having people take a test, which provoked a huge protest and the wonderful political slogan, "Fuck the algorithm." If work is a battleground, then work from home may be the latest front. Here, new creative tactics of subversion are in evidence. If you work from home, you can download a mouse jiggler, which either has a bit of software, which kind of simulates productivity, or simulates at least being online. If downloading something and installing open source software is a bit intimidating, you can try a more analog solution, a more old school solution to keep your mouse moving, right? Workers learn the rhythm of screenshots and work around them. And there's newly widespread areas of friction, such as poor connectivity on Zoom. Maybe some of you experienced this in home or school, right? Never quite works as well as you'd like. That can also be exploited. So there's a kind of artist, hacker, Sam Levine, created this program called the Zoom Escaper that can supplement a teleconference. You can add echo or delay or sound effects like a crying baby, right? That sounds like your connection's kind of dodgy, right? From these examples, right, so these are kind of maybe new forms of resistance, emerging resistance in this work from home recomposition. A lot of them are funny. They appear as kind of maybe this last-ditch weapon of the weak, right? Can the militant resistance to technologies that threaten to de-skill and destroy ways of life have any lasting success? Are we trapped in this kind of typical sort of academic conundrum where we celebrate these small resistances while everything else gets worse? I would like to turn to the history of the web to give an example of a more lasting Luddish contribution. If we view Luddism as a struggle over subsumption, then the digital world of today is rife with it. As Brazilian left communist collective Humana Esfera has noted, the rise of proprietary and de-skilled digital enclosures, this is a term from Mark Andrejevic, of Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, or what my former UFA colleague Anna Hellman describes as the platformization of the web, represents a transition from formal subsumption of digital life to real subsumption. Social media is only the latest aspect of the capitalist rationalization of everyday life that has accompanied the machinic rationalization of the workplace since at least Henry Ford. Right? Henry Ford is famous for the assembly line, but he also closely monitored his workers. They lived in neighborhoods he designed. Sociologists would visit the home to make sure they had like a proper family structure, to make sure that they obeyed gender roles, to make sure they were not speaking their native languages. Right? This transition to the really subsumed internet has been marked by resistance from digital cultures that seek to preserve both their skills and defend against real subsumption via encroaching commodification and datification of surveillance capitalism, aka hackers, right? Not in the cyber criminal sense, but in the cool sense, right? From the 90s. From dark web technologies like Tor to privacy plugins like Request Policy, which in its ceaseless quest to root out third-party requests ends up rendering most browsers as unusable as a smashed stocking frame. It's a program developed by one of my colleagues at the UFA, Max Gas. Free software programming, a cornerstone of hacker culture, was itself born out of Luddite initiatives by Richard Stallman to preserve coding from being owned and controlled by large corporations through copyright. And due to its success, programming has largely remained a craft profession ever since. A lot of autonomy, the reason why they are desirable jobs, right, is actually due to a successful workers' struggle, is my argument. Rather than leave technological development to entrepreneurs in the assumption that it can be taken over wholesale by yet-to-come leftist political formations, Stallman and other Luddite technologists recognized that technology is a flashpoint of actually existing struggle in the current moment. Further, they demonstrate that struggles against technologies of subsumption can not only win, but can also illuminate a path of alternative, more egalitarian technological development. I think there's an urgent need to think about how Luddite technologies could reach and impact more internet users beyond the most skilled enthusiasts, right? You can't just ask, grandma and grandpa to install Linux and use it, right? It's not going to work very well. Particularly as more and more activity, in particular work in governance, moves into online spaces subject to dynamics of surveillance capitalism. How many do I have?
How much do you need?
Yeah, not very much.
Okay, no, it's perfect.
So, right, with my remaining time, I'd like to sketch what I take to be the content of Luddism. Its suggestion of a positive program beyond reactions to kind of technological abuse. I would say Luddism shares with many workers' struggles at the point of production an emphasis on autonomy. Sorry, I bulleted this. It's my professor mode slipping back on. Freedom of conduct, ability to set standards, continuity of working conditions. For the Luddites specifically, new technology was an immediate threat. So Luddism contains a critical perspective on technology. I would say critical, not against technology necessarily, but to evaluate it from a political viewpoint, which examines its relationship to the labor process and working conditions. And therefore, you see that technology is a site of struggle. Luddism rejects production for production's sake and is critical of efficiency because it recognizes that there are other values at stake in work. I think what's important is that Luddism can generalize. It's not an individual moral stance, like, oh, I disagree with surveillance, so I make sure I reject cookies on every website that I open up. I mean, I do that, but I don't think that that's especially effective, right? So we need to think about in terms of practices that are generalizable. Not individual moral stances, but practices that can proliferate and build. And finally, that Luddism is antagonistic. It is a political stance which recognizes irreconcilable conflict at work and the necessity of struggle. And then to connect to this, I think there are a number of sort of movements or tendencies that exist today that kind of speak to some of these concerns. Movements that are growing and even actually achieving some success. And it might be nice to talk about those and maybe others that you all know of. It's always an advantage of traveling around, giving talks. So first, in the face of acceleration, we should insist on deceleration. That technology should not be unfettered, but should be controlled, slowed, regulated, and even forbidden. One example that I can point to is that facial recognition technologies are being banned in a number of US cities. China has issued new regulations on recommendation algorithms for their social media platforms to make them less abusive and more transparent, and give users the right to opt out. So potentially Europe will follow this example rather than the sort of laissez-faire American example. Some labor laws already protect against some of the most invasive tracking software, and these could be bolstered and spread. The public is very receptive to the idea of regulating automation, right, protecting jobs in that way. So again, political potential there, I would say. Second, in the Taylorist imperative to de-skill and thus disempower workers can also be resisted by reskilling. There's movements around maintenance and repair that celebrate the essential yet non-productive work of those who keep vital systems functional through an intimate knowledge of their functioning. There's the right to repair movement, which is also a path towards a less wasteful supply chains. They also hold workshops on how you can fix your devices. Those are actually, they're winning legislative victories, actually, where companies say, oh, you can't change your iPhone, you can't do this. They're losing those battles, some of them, because of this movement, right? I think even the European legacy of squatters and hack labs, though it's not the peak of that, might still have some use in their kind of pedagogical function, where they teach others how to take back control of their technology. And indeed, and I know this from my students, a generation that's been raised on simplified apps and social media has come of age with a very dim understanding of how computers actually work, right? If they are digital natives, it's not a positive value. That means they don't actually, they take everything for granted. They don't understand how anything works, right? So kind of teaching them again how to take back control of this could be an emergent source of building social power. Third, in response to capitalist imperatives for ever greater productivity, efficiency, and growth, this will probably be a little controversial, we could advocate for degrowth. Luddites are not technophobes, but provide a critical lens on how technology can or cannot advance other values and bring productivity to sustainable levels. Luddite skepticism is absolutely warranted when it comes to speculative technological solutions for climate change, such as carbon capture or cloud seeding, right? People keep talking about this. And, you know, I'm ready for that to work, but it doesn't work, and it looks very difficult to scale. We need to think of other solutions, right? It is also not technology that will liberate us from overwork and drudgery, but our own radical activity that can advance this goal. So I don't see it as equal to degrowth, but I see points of convergence there, which I think are useful to consider, right? Degrowth is quite heterogeneous, right, in people's perspectives, but I think there's potential for Marxists and perhaps Marxist Luddites to clarify again the stakes of some of this politics, right? And finally, against the tendency of technology to fragment our work, to isolate us, to undermine our forms of solidarity, we should compose the class. Worker organizing is happening up and down the value chain, but we should also recognize the moments of resistance, refusal, and defiance that fly under the radar, but become the strata for creating solidarity and can build, sometimes quickly, into stronger forms of activity. We do not have the luxury of imagining that capitalist development and its brand of innovation will simplify the class struggle for us, or still less, make socialism inevitable. Right? We don't have that. I don't think we have the privilege of that confident viewpoint that Marx sometimes espoused, and that's certainly carried over into the next generation of Marxists. Right? I think that we have to look at where things are right now, and figure out how to act. And okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gavin. It was really a cool forthright on Sunday morning, and also the time was totally on point. So we can immediately go to the Q&A. Unlike yesterday, I would suggest to make more ping pong game than collect 7 or 8 questions. Birgit, would you like to use these microphones? You can of course ask questions either in German or in English. Please just raise your hand and Birgit will give you the microphone. Or you.
Thank you. I honestly, because we talked about this practical critique, I don't know, maybe because...
Schön langsam sprechen, weil wir haben ja die Dolmetscher, die müssen immer mitkommen.
I mean, I come from global zoo, no? And I don't know, I see for example, what Newton said and then what Einstein said. Also was Newton, what was saying was true in its own vocabulary, but then come new vocabulary, you know? And what I, in these days, and also from your speech understood, is so abstract, there is no geographical point in it, nothing. We talk about class, worker, capital, and and maybe one time was this contradiction between them, but now if you look from my point of view, that a lot of people from global south share it, is if you see ecological, or social, economical, everything, there is a difference now, this enemy is between north and south, it's not between workers and between capital. The workers here are politically with the capitalists here, you know, show me one fight here in the last 50 years against imperialism in the West. Nothing. From the white, nothing. Nothing, no? So it's fascism from the white point of view. It's like, the point is just like this time in the Europe, what happened in the Europe. No, but we see like the whole 500 years like fascism, like everywhere, and like it's colonial and everything, and it's still continuing, and we have the fascism in the Middle East everywhere, and it's like, no, the fascism is that. And I mean, all the topics, everything you are talking is like so meaningless, so like abstract, I mean, in some way, you know, that for example, if we talk about like destroying or like, breaking the machine, you know, but for us, like the liberation movements is like we try to destroy as less as possible in our country, you know, like we don't have that privilege, like we cannot just destroy what's a small part that we have also, like, and like what else, like for example surveillance, like I mean yeah, it's like you cancel the cookies, but like who is facing this surveillance, you know? We in the from the frontex in North Africa, they're going in the Mediterranean Sea who want to pass and they survive, you know, like they look at them and they shoot at them and they stop them, you know, that, I mean, everything you are saying, we are facing it, you are not facing it at all. Like, I see like, as like Rodney say, you know, until there is racism, there is black and white. You know, and we don't believe as a communist or Marxist or like, we don't believe that this is like a real, like something should be like this. But until there is this oppression, you know, there is this separation, there is this geographical separation. You are from the north, we are from the south. And that is the real contradiction now. Okay, just ecologically, you know, like, we say like...
Okay, but don't hold a whole speech, so either make a question or a comment, that's great, but not make it too long, please, because there are others as well who might get it.
I said what is ecological, you know, because it's like, I'm also not like knowing everything, or I'm not sure, you know, because you are a professor, you can tell me maybe I'm wrong somewhere, or I don't understand Marxism or whatever, but like ecologically, you know, like materialistic, what is happening now is like million people in global south already are displaced, already are facing shit, you know. Also, it's affect the norm, it's affect like also Venice maybe, but here we see like the technology for the gardening, everything, green politics, everything is developing, and at one point when we are almost apart, you don't have problem. You can extract the mines, everything as you extract the things in the Mars, in the other planets, you know. You don't need any people from the global zone anymore. And we see this like a threat, it's real threat that we see is this one, you know. I mean, you said 47%.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you because this is a whole speech you are holding. So either you have, so I think you make your point very clear that so there is a particular history of the privileged North and doesn't include so much the perspective of the global South. You want to directly?
Yeah, I think that as Marxists, we have to recognize and deal with imperial social relations. I don't think it's true that it is a struggle between North and South. I think you have, I mean, the Marxist perspective is the Southern societies are also class, right? And their ruling classes collaborate with the ruling classes of the North. And the answer to that is international solidarity. I agree that it is lacking.
It's not exist. Sure.
Okay, so the point of this presentation, right? Also, a lot of worker politics aren't existing, right? And so the even at a level that they were 50 years ago, right? Probably in living memory of some people in this room, and yet, you know, they're still here. They're showing up, and we thank them for that. So part of this presentation is to think about how do you restart a more militant kind of activity, right? Rather than being content to buy green products in the store or simply vote for the party who seems nicest or whatever and let everything get worse, right? Every time there's, so I think that is really the task of our time, right? Is how do you one, forge a perspective that says we don't have the time or luxury to kind of incrementally improve little by little things because it's not happening, we don't have the time. So how do we have a more sort of antagonistic stance? How do we develop that? And then how do we broaden it? Because we also, it's not good enough for just, even if everyone in this room said, well, obviously you don't, but everyone else said 100% they agree with what I said. That's not enough, right? We need large movements. We have large movements happening globally right at this very moment, and it would be interesting to think about how people on the Marxist left might engage with that, and think about how, when people are in the street, when people are saying we've had enough, how you say yeah, and we have perspectives that can better develop and help you better understand these things that upset you, that you're finding out about, that mobilize you, right? I mean, to me, this is our task. It's not an easy one, right? And yeah, we've had it's been a disappointing, well, been fairly disappointing my entire life about these things. But yeah, I mean, that's precisely the goal of this project, is to say, is to pose that question, right? We live in a depoliticized environment, right?
In Europe, yeah.
In Europe, yeah, in many places, right? The dream is not to develop a society, it's to find the best place to live and then move there, right? That's everyone's dream now, right? It's a very different perspective. So I think then, regardless of what our sort of the way we put the problems that we face or the ones that we want to tackle, I think, you know, that is the shared kind of point of convergence, right? And in my experience, when people start having a sort of more militant, comprehensive, antagonistic stance on one place, it's easier to move them and say, look, this is not just something that happens in work. This is something that happens in your workplace. This is something that happens to everyone in your workplace. This is something that happens to everyone who has to work for a wage in the economy. There's global dynamics as well, right? The very fantasy that we can automate all the bad work away is, there's some really interesting kind of sort of philosophy and literary theory that looks at the genealogy of this idea. It is really the genealogy of having a sort of infinitely exploitable, sort of non-human subject, right? In fact, the word robot is a Czech word for sort of forced labor, right? And so in some ways, the imaginary of automation is an imaginary of slavery, right? Of having a workforce that you don't have to care about, right? Do all the tasks that need to be done. And I think that once we can if we can abandon those fantasies and take seriously the idea that the things we need have to be made by people, and that those people deserve dignity, right, and freedom, and are just like us, then that doesn't solve the problems, right? But that's one step.
It's too late, yes.
There was one, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like bring up maybe the unpopular question of if we don't automate away the bad jobs, the question is, of course, of a socialist project to minimize them to some extent. And I understand you also in that sense that Luddism is not necessarily abolitionism in a pure negation, but as a form of transformation. And there is this whole tradition of critical Marxists looking at labor processes. And at the same time, so the first part of my question is what would be the qualities of a socialist use of machinery? Yeah? How does the existing practices and technologies have to change? But more unpopular point maybe I want to bring up is how do we deal as a socialist with this tragic dilemma that these alienating forms of productions are to a degree so far more productive than what we consider unalienated work. Yeah? And maybe just to give some numbers to it. When Henry Ford introduced the assembly line in 1930, it took Ford 250 hours to produce the Model T in 1911. 10 years later, they reduced it to 50 hours. It's 5-time reduction through these horrible alienating working conditions that workers only endured because he had to reduce this $5 workday to compensate them with the money to bear with his burden. And of course, we have to face the reality to some degree that, of course, we can just consume less, but at the same time, it's not only about cars in that example, but also about communal luxuries. The same applies for the production of medicine, for the production of train networks, and so on. And I would be very much interested how an emancipated society deals with this problem. And I think there's a real dilemma because people like Andrew Feenberg, for example, proposes something that a third way. It's not the unfolding of instrumental rationality, but we have to come up for a critical rationality that's equally productive as this capitalist one. But I fear I don't see materializing in any of this. For me, it feels like a dilemma that we have to choose between material wealth on one side or really the emancipation of every last person working in this process.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, right? And this is actually, I think, one of the major problems that I'm sort of interested in dealing with, sort of at the next level of after this one, which is what do you do? So, what do you do with the problem of what is necessary work, right? Just to also note, all those efficiently produced cars have now created a huge problem for all of us, right? But so I think this is where some of the interesting ecological thought that sometimes gets roped in under degrowth can be quite interesting, because we can actually start, like, why don't we sit down and determine what work is actually necessary? There's a lot of work that people do that is not. I'm not such a, I have my criticisms of David Graeber's bullshit jobs, but he was good at coming up with catchy slogans, so we can run with it. People like it. There's a lot of pointless work that people have to do because they just need to do a wage, right? They just need to create a wage, right? There's a lot of work and also resources plowed into these machine learning systems that the only use cases are essentially to like plagiarize term papers, right? Like using incredible amounts of electricity and water, right? That are basically toys, or just make my job really shitty. So I think that would be, you sit down and you say, okay, what do we actually need to produce, right? We say, okay, well, we do need transportation, we do need trains, we do need electricity, but we do need someone to take out the garbage, right? To collect the garbage. Is there a way that we can reduce these like bullshit jobs, the pointless jobs that don't actually provide any use value relevant to the masses, or don't provide anything in terms of real sort of social value? Remove them, and then yes, we will still have quite a lot of tasks that need to be done. But maybe then the question is not always a technological one, right? How do we get more technology to do it for us? But how do we more equitably spread the work around, right? Can we rethink a division of labor? In some ways, right, like, it's weird to move from the US to the Netherlands, which I don't think the Dutch reputation is to be like, is very communalist, right? They're always telling me how individualist they are, but from an American perspective, they're absolutely not. But there's a lot of like, if you were responsible in your sort of commune or district or whatever for doing more of the reproductive tasks, not just for at the family level, but on a society level, right? Maintaining roads, maintaining, providing food, or all these other kinds of tasks that are absolutely necessary for human survival and thriving. I think that would make for very different social relations among the people that they're not strangers to you, right? They're not, you're not living in a kind of atomized sort of late capitalist kind of environment, right? Which is also, to me, one of the points of a different mode of production. Is not just a different way of producing things, but a different way of relating to one another, right? and a different way of relating to our productive activity. So I'm kind of interested in the idea of, all right, figuring out what is necessary labor, what is unnecessary labor, and then how can we reorganize that necessary labor in more equitable ways, right? Do we want to relocalize forms of production? Do we want to take forms of production offline? Do we want to work share in various ways? Develop skills, right? I always read like Americans talking about how good they are at restaurants, like what a good customer they are at restaurants because they worked in restaurants. And I think that's true, but what if like instead of being good at being a good restaurant customer and being like nice to your server and tipping them well or whatever, you do have to tip in the States, so if you ever go there, please do that. What if instead of developing those skills, right, you spent your youth like repairing bikes, repairing roads, learning how to operate a mill or something like that, right? Like doing those kind of necessary skills, right? I think that there's a lot of, that's kind of what a lot of my imagining around this problem, which I think is absolutely central that you bring up. That's kind of where I'm going with that. But I don't have a lot of answers for you, but I think it's about posing those questions and then you figure out a kind of course of research, right, to try to start to answer them.
Okay, then I think you already have the microphone.
Vielen Dank für die Reihe.
Wait a second, he has to.
Vielen Dank für die Reihe kleiner Beispiele, wie wir individuell uns wehren können gegen digitale Zumutungen in der Arbeit. Ich habe gehofft, und dass vielleicht auch sozusagen, dass du auch auf offensive Mittel zu sprechen kommst und auch also du kollektivierst diese individuellen defensiven Praxen und ich sehe halt auch schon offensive Praxen, die kollektiviert sind, aber die politisch degeneriert sind. Stichwort Ransomware. Und in die Richtung träume ich und würde gerne mehr reden. Wie können wir uns das als politische Bewegung aneignen? Wie können wir mit denen, die das technisch können, ins Gespräch kommen, um sie sozusagen politisch ranzuholen? Ich soll es kurz erläutern. Ransomware sind diese Computerviren, die einzelne Computer oder ganze Netzwerke verschlüsseln und an die Entschlüsselung Forderungen stellen. Degeneriert politisch deshalb, weil die Forderungen im Moment immer darin bestehen, irgendwie eine Menge digitales Geld irgendwo zu hinterlegen und dann wird wieder entschlüsselt. Aber das könnten ja genauso gut auch arbeitsbezogene Forderungen sein, die sich in aktuelle Kämpfe einordnen oder wenn man eine Waffenschmiede stilllegt, friedenspolitisch formulierte Forderungen und so weiter und so fort. Kann auch temporär sein, ohne Forderung. Also solange der Hafen Waffen exportiert, wird er Ransom gewährt und fertig. Und die Mittel dazu, und auch drüber zu reden, ist ja legal. Es mag subversiv sein, aber es ist legal. Offensive Security ist das Stichwort, in dem ich im offenen Netz alles finde, was ich dafür brauche. Es ist eine legal beworbene Linux-Distribution, Kali, Linux, K-A-L-I, Linux, die beinhaltet vorkonfiguriert alle Mittel, die ich brauche, um offensiv Security zu machen. Die Organisation hinter Kali Linux, also die freie Softwareprogrammierer, die bieten Workshops an, in denen sich ausbilden zu einem Offensive Security Dienstleister. Häuser, die ihre Netze sauber halten wollen und sicher halten wollen, die kaufen diese Dienstleistung ein und simulieren einen Einbruchsversuch und dichten dann entsprechend ab. Und wir können das alles frei verfügbar nehmen und unsere sozusagen ludditische Fantasie da freien Lauf lassen. Die Frage daran gekoppelt, wie kommen wir mit denen ins Gespräch, die das sowieso schon tun, damit sie ihre Aktionen politisch wenden, oder von mir aus beides, die Bitcoin und die politische Forderung. Dann hat der Angegriffene die Wahl, welche Forderung er erfüllt. So. Und die Aufforderung an uns selbst, aneignen wir uns das an, was als Möglichkeiten offen vor uns liegt.
All right. AKA the crime question. I mean, I love the what you're thinking about it. It's really interesting, right? to think about how to reappropriate these tools, and certainly like there's a certain kind of militance there. I think that I'm always a bit hesitant for a variety of reasons to sort of like endorse open crime in public settings where I don't know who all of you are. But I think that if you're going to engage in, I think that the potentials that you identify are quite interesting, right? If you want to engage in that level of activity, you need to be very well organized. And the people involved need to understand the risks and how to mitigate them. My understanding, this is always like the kind of joking question, like why is your org selling newspapers to raise money or whatever it is? You should be robbing banks like the Bolsheviks did. Like, okay, well, robbing a bank doesn't do you much good if you all end up in jail or dead after it, right? So anything like that, I don't know. I'm coming from a U.S. context and partly a Dutch context, which is in some ways even less hopeful on radical militancy, right? That we have the level of sort of sophisticated organizations that can deploy these kind of tactics, can protect the people involved, can also position the use of these tactics in a way that it doesn't come off as simply crime, right, or self-interested, but has attractive political goals that other people are interested in. But I think those kinds of things, yeah, would potentially be the future. How do we get in contact with them? Well, if you work at a hospital, they'll contact you. And actually, they're often quite friendly in that, in many cases, what they'll do is they have a kind of auto-generated message. It'll say, here's how to buy cryptocurrency to pay the ransom and send it to us. They assume you don't have any technological background, so they walk you through the steps, and you can contact them. And in many cases, people contact them and say, plead their case. Say, actually, I'm facing financial hardship, or this is a hospital, it's really important, we have babies here, or something. And they actually like say, oh, so, okay, and they negotiate a lower price, or sometimes say, okay, it's a free one on us, or something like that. I don't know actually how to connect to these groups, and I'd be cautious to do so because many of them are, part of organized crime, right? And even at their level, I think some of those people are kind of interesting and cool, but they work for people who are, I would say, not sympathetic to our ends. Yeah, I think it's actually a fascinating potential. I would love to see, in fact, the way you describe it, shutting down a harbor for these reasons, it almost seems like it's around the corner. And I think that those of us who are interested in these kind of more larger scale actions, on the one hand, yes, we have to have a kind of technical ability and connections to people that do, but I also think we have to have the kinds of political organizations that are willing to take these risks and also willing to, or have the capability to make a sort of, to show that these actions have like a widespread appeal. There's another thing that always, like every few months goes viral. They're always fake, but they always, these like memes go viral about someone who like hacked the U.S. Department of Ed and like started deleting people's student loans. And they always go viral because people are very sympathetic to that. I mean, it's not actually possible to do that in that simple way. But I think, yeah, the potential is there. I mean, you also have people here doing risky and even illegal actions. I think I saw someone with the people who rescue migrants from the sea, right? They go to jail for that, and it's going to get worse probably. But they're also quite inspiring, right? And I think illustrate a path forward. And I think what we need to do is have the organizations behind it that can support those people and protect them as well. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to you, but I love that example that you gave. So thank you.
I think you have already the microphone. And then you, and then I would stop it because at a certain point, okay, then this will be the last because there's a lot of people who needs to go to the station for the train.
And you could also just talk to me afterwards. And
yeah, okay, that's always.
I really liked the points you made about incorporation of technology within the class struggle and the risk related to automation process. However, it was really quite an easy opposition that you presented at the end. It really works well in US context. That we have on one hand side we have expansive capitalism which incorporates more and more spheres of life. On the other hand, we have degrowth, individual or collective resist and revolution tactics. However, how would you, and there comes the question, how would you position the Luddism potential and the Luddism movements within the European Union when you have green sustainable capitalism and somehow incorporated all of that already? We already regulate the technology, we already regulate AI and so on, and we tend to build sustainable degrowth. So is there any role to play for Luddism movement in that context?
Yeah, actually, I mean, the sort of capital of degrowth is Barcelona, so it's in the EU for now. I mean, to me, one thing I find actually very inspiring is the EU is willing to regulate these kind of technologies, right? And I'm constantly, when I moved to Europe, I worked in the media studies department, so everyone's like an expert on GDPR, and they're all very critical of it, right? It always doesn't do enough, and I've been there long enough that now I'm starting to agree. But when I first got there, it was amazing to me, right? It was like such a big improvement over the US. I think that you know, I'm not someone who takes like regulation or state reforms off the table in thinking about these kinds of things by any means. I do think that the EU is kind of stuck in a contradiction because on the one hand, it doesn't have an independent, it doesn't have a very independent sort of tech development, right? In many ways, it's reliant on innovations that come from the US or from China, and then they figure out how to integrate it. But there's no kind of definitive break and a definitive, like, let's create a kind of clear, distinct, independent European path for technological development. It's very muddy and very compromised. I think we'll also see potentially we're already seeing, you know, a lot of the sort of more optimism of the past few years about, okay, we're getting green development, sustainability under control within a capitalist system, is going to come into question because the investment climate is much worse now. So already in the Netherlands, for instance, Shell is backing away from all the commitments that they've made for 2030. And you also have populist movements that are opposed to meeting those goals. So I'm not so confident that Europe has figured it out. I do think the terrain is very different, right? For the reasons that you point out. It's something I tried to learn more about, but I think there is still room to say, if we want to push things in a different direction, right? I don't think that, also my sense of European politics is it's not very left-leaning. And I think the people in this room would wish it would be, right? I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but that's a general sense that I get. And how do we start to do that? And I think one thing that people come to me and want to talk about, and again, I think you're right, it's easy to come from an American context where we have two parties that are completely unsympathetic to any kind of, to very much in the way of regulation or left-wing politics in general, and that's it. But still, also here, and so being outside is sort of the natural sort of perspective. You already assume once you have certain commitments that the existing establishment's not going to represent that, and how do you do that outside of it? Here it is a bit different, but I also get the sense that there is also an interest in developing a more sort of critical and also independent and clear stance to move politics in a very different direction than where it's going in the EU. But yeah, it's a great question. The terrain is quite different, right? So the tactics and the approaches might be different as well. But I think that some of what I say is still sort of relevant to thinking about the EU context.
Dan.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As a fan of sort of fully automated luxury communism, I found your talk surprisingly convincing.
Okay.
I have two quick questions. Maybe you can pick which one you want to answer. So the first one connects very much to the first question that was raised about socialist use of machinery. And in your answer, you actually talk more about a socialist remodeling of the labor process. But actually, I was wondering whether there are also normative criteria for which technologies are adequate to that we could attach to that. So that would be the first question. And the second question was more about scale of action and how do we, like, which technologies allow us to go from not just individual resistance at the workplace, but can actually be sort of, you know, inspire a broader movement against a particular, like, which can be a flashpoint technology that, in your view, could spark a broader movement beyond the immediate workplace.
Yeah, what are the normative values? I mean, I think in that sense, I would want to defer to the people who have the most sort of intimate knowledge of that, who are the people who are working within those systems, right? That I don't know if there's like a one-size-fits-all answer. I do think, I want to be clear, while I'm critical of fully automated luxury communism, I do think that the reduction of work, reduction of working hours is absolutely desirable, and something that should be on the table. But as to the kind of the texture of work and what is and is not the way to do things, I think I'm not in a position to answer those questions. And I think that's where you would have, once you have some sort of more democratic elements within the workplace, and also the kind of interest in asking and researching these questions, we'd start to get somewhere. There are places, right, that have tried, there's experiments that have tried this. The Lucas plan is like a famous one, where you had this like airplane. They were making weapons in the UK, and they had a bunch of academics, like organizational sociologists and stuff, working with them. And they really came up with plans on how to work differently, but also how to make different things. And of course, then it sort of, you know, faced a completely unsympathetic political structure, and it was like, and then it was over. It didn't happen. But I think those kinds of things are quite inspiring, and maybe look the way that what I'm envisioning would look. Sorry, can you remind me what was your second question?
Flashpoint technologies for automation.
I mean, there's an interesting kind of discussion about concentration versus centralization last night at Ricardo's talk, right? That the idea that one of the things that capitalism has done in the past 50 years is actually to isolate workers from one another, right? And you see this in the Amazon warehouses. In the US, they don't even have break rooms, so workers, when they're not working, they just go and sit in their car and like eat a snack by themselves, right? Whereas in Italy, the law says you have to have a break room, and so workers meet in the break room, and surprise, surprise, there's strikes all the time in the Amazon warehouses. Yeah, that mandated espresso has political effects, right? So, I think this is, you know, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of answer to this, but I think we do need to really consider this as people who want to, if we're interested in organizing workers or politicizing work, that one of the main or a very significant challenge that we face is the isolation that workers are faced from one another. And overcoming those happens in very interesting ways, right? You have like, in the US, I'm always cautious to endorse this, but it does seem to be the case, at least in some recent big labor struggles, that church has been a significant ingredient, not because of religion itself, but because that was a way that people talk to one another, right? And also express values, right? And I think, you know, again, I'm not endorsing Christian socialism at all, but I think that it, you know, thinking about those kind of spaces and practices of connecting to one another can be that. I also think that to engage in certain kinds of sabotage or these other kind of subversive activities, you can't just do it by yourself. You need You need accomplices. You need people who are won't tell on you, right? Or maybe help you out a bit. And so my other wager is that actually some of these practices are ways to connect to one another, to see like, hey, oh, you're just as pissed off as I am. And actually, I know, I know the ransomware guy to talk to, or something like that.
I think if there is one solution fits all, then it's every workplace has a break room.
Good start.
It would be a good start. So, last question is on you.
Ja, ich bin vielleicht etwas spät zur Party.
But wait a second, you need to.
I'm a bit late to the party, so ich habe die ganze Zeit mich gefragt, wenn es darum geht, sich zu fragen, wo kann es Widerstand geben in der Form von modernem Buddhismus, müsste man ja analysieren, bei der Klassenzusammensetzung, also über welche potenziellen Subjekte redet man. Und jetzt zum Schluss, das hat mich etwas versöhnt, diese Überlegungen bezüglich der Amazon-Arbeiter, wie können die Widerstand leisten, dass natürlich die gemeinsamen Zusammenkünfte wichtig sind. Aber ich denke, wenn es um die Gruppe geht, die ja hier implizit angesprochen wurde, die im weitesten Sinne Informationsarbeiterinnen, die Leute, die Software machen oder betreiben, das ist ja im weitesten Sinne Arbeiteraristokratie, wenn man diesen Namen nochmal, diesen Begriff von Lenin aufrufen will. Und da finde ich, muss man einfach feststellen, dass es da ja einen Exzess gibt von erstmal freiwillig, die Kooperation der Arbeitenden dem Kapital kostenlos zur Verfügung zu stellen. Das ist ja ein Punkt, der auch auftauchte gestern in den Grundrisse-Lektüre, was Herr Marx betont, die Arbeitskraft wird bezahlt, aber die Kooperation in der Arbeitstätigkeit, die gibt es kostenlos für das Kapital. Und das ist ja in allem, was mit Informationsverarbeitung, Softwareerstellung und Betrieb zusammenhängt, geradezu exzessiv. Und das, finde ich, sollten wir erstmal problematisieren und betrachten, wie man das wieder einfangen kann. Und da hast du jetzt genannt, dieses Beispiel der offenen oder freien Software. Und das sehe ich ja gerade zum Beispiel dafür, wie dieser Drang nach Autonomie, nach Selbstbestimmung der Arbeitenden ein weiteres kostenloses Gut für das Kapital bereitgestellt hat. Also ich kenne das aus eigener Erfahrung, ich bin Softwareentwickler, dass natürlich gerade inzwischen freie und offene Software zentraler Bestandteil ist von ganz viel kommerzieller Softwareproduktion und Verwertung. Und da haben praktisch diese Pioniere, Stallman und so, etwas in Gang gesetzt, was am Ende dem Kapital also drastisch zugute kam. Und zum Beispiel IBM ist da auch groß eingestiegen später, das Ganze mitfinanziert. Also erstmal so eine Untersuchung, was sind eigentlich die Bewusstseinslagen von den Leuten, die da an den Hebeln sitzen in diesen IT-Technologien, und wie kann man davon abbringen, wie die Wahnsinnigen ihre Kooperationskräfte ständig einzusetzen für das Kapital. Ich erlebe das jeden Tag. Ne? Die Kollegen sind kaum zu bremsen und begeistern sich für diese scheinbare Autonomie in der Kooperation.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question, a really important question, and it also, I think, something that stood out to me in Ricardo's presentation last night as well. To me, some of this, I think you're right that cooperation is instrumentalized by capital. It provides a value to capital. And so then you say there are two kind of positions you could take. You say, well, we need to withdraw this cooperation or get rid of it, or maybe make it wage or however to recognize it, right? To have capital recognize it, and so that we don't give it away unconditionally. That could be one option. I think the other option is to say in spite of my critiques, there are certain sort of tendencies and dynamics that produced through the recomposition of the working class that are maybe things we want to hold on to in a sort of, when we move beyond capitalism. We will still want elements of cooperation, coordination, and things like that in a changed mode of production. So maybe we don't want to withdraw those or undermine them at this level. Maybe we want to think about how we would preserve them or even strengthen them when we move beyond capitalism. A lot of the actually interesting debates on this revolve around care work. So the idea that, this is where the debate becomes very clear, like forms of care such as child care or health care, elder care, it's better when people have put in emotion to it. But also this becomes a mechanism of exploitation. And I'm not so sure that a more egalitarian society would want less emotion invested in care, which to me seems to be something that some people do tend to argue, well, we should have that be waged, or we should refuse that. And it does actually happen, in fact, right? This is like the degrading of care under capitalist social relations. Some people do recognize that they're burnt out from all the care they do, or they burn out from all the extra work they do in the tech sector, right? They put in these extra hours because of their passion, but they hit a limit. So, and I think I'm sort of a bit more interested in retaining some of this more, maybe not spontaneous, but this more sort of organic kind of forms of collaboration and coordination, right? As far as how do you get tech workers, I mean, there are sort of challenges, right? Because of their class position, they tend to be, they're not subject to the same kinds of exploitation or the same kinds of problems, right, that other workers face. I mean, one interesting initiative, the Alphabet Workers Union, was a deliberate attempt for the most privileged workers at Alphabet, which is the company that Google is, that's our holding company, so essentially Google, the most privileged programmers to kind of combine with other workers who worked at Google, including like custodial staff or the people who work in the cafeterias. It doesn't always work very well, and I think a lot of people are very inexperienced when they started these things. Someone in the Netherlands that researches this, Robert Dorschel, is doing a lot of research on the subjectivity of tech workers to kind of investigate this question. What he's found so far, it's a big project to do this, but I'm familiar with some of his research, is that the more privileged workers are really motivated by a particular feeling of morality. It's not existential in the sense that I can't pay my rent, I can't put food in my children's mouths. That's not motivating it. It is a kind of liberal morality, and that of course comes with limitations, right? But to me, that research is really important because, again, I don't think the answer is not to see it as an impossible task, but as a potential terrain of struggle, right? Okay, now we need to understand who they are and how they're feeling, so we think about what are the techniques to get them to combine this stuff. It seems like the big motivations for these struggles were the overall sort of political dissatisfaction with the American political climate under Trump, but also the use of Google. One thing that really kind of radicalized programmers at Google, was Google's involvement with military contracting. And that actually got a lot of the high-level programmers angry. They began to organize, actually Google canceled several of these contracts, but the sort of organizing continued for a while after that, right? It's a challenge, but maybe not an insurmountable one, but I do think it's important as well.
Okay, I think there's finally the concluding words. I switch into German. Ich wechsle ins Deutsche, um die Schlussworte zu sprechen. Ich möchte mich nochmal ganz herzlich bei Gavin für seinen tollen Parcours bedanken.